Hello and welcome to Lecture 7 on Plato's theaetetus. This lecture is a deeper look at the self-refutation argument. I introduced this last time. There are really three connected arguments that we're looking at, but one of them in particular, I wanted to go into more depth with it because it looks like an easy argument to understand. But there are also objections that come to your mind when you think about it a little bit more. And there's a way to explain the argument where you understand why those objections aren't actually good ones. So that's why I want to look at this more deeply. Now, there's one piece of literature on this particular topic that is exceptionally good and that I've taken a lot from. And that's by Miles Bernier, who actually edited our book. He's certainly one of the greatest people working in ancient philosophy in the last little while. And he's worth reading. So I'm going to put that up on Canvas. And especially if you want a deeper understanding of this issue, which is actually kind of an exciting one, I think. I think this is one of the more exciting discussions in Plato. And there's a lot of them. So if you want to get a deeper understanding, go ahead and read that. So the first thing I want to make clear is what we mean by self-refutation. Because maybe it's obvious, but maybe it's not. And at very least, if you think a bit about this issue, you see that there are different ways that you could be said to engage in something like self-refutation. So I want to look at the different ways that seem relevant anyway. So self-refutation is basically when you refute yourself. And refuting obviously is giving a good argument against, a conclusive argument against, right? If you refute a position, you give a conclusive argument against it. One that someone you think, has to accept. And if they accept it, it means that their position is false. The conclusion that they want to argue for is false. Now, that is a kind of argument, right? Because refuting normally is something that we think of arguments doing. You give an argument that refutes something. You can also give evidence that refutes something. If you say you have irrefutable evidence, it means evidence that definitely, securely proves the thing that you want the evidence to prove, right? Like if you have fingerprints, that is irrefutable evidence that this person did it once you have a match. So there's a kind of how good of a proof do I have for this thing? And with refutation, the thing is always that you're overturning something. You're showing that something doesn't make sense or is false. And you refute yourself in the broader sense, we could say, when you provide a kind of evidence against your own position, or your position provides a kind of evidence against itself, or a sentence that you might speak provides a kind of evidence against itself. So that's an idea that we can take to this list. So we have here different varieties of this kind of thing where in some way or another, a speaker or someone who holds a position provides the best evidence against that position. Or maybe not the best, but irrefutable evidence. You don't get any better than irrefutable. But there might be other pieces of irrefutable evidence. So we have here the first kinds of cases, which are really what we would call self-contradictory sentences. The sentence is false. If the sentence is false, then that means the sentence is true. Now, these kinds of self-contradictory statements have an undefined truth value. Right? Like you can't determine what the truth of that is. It causes an error because you just keep going back and forth. This sentence is false. Okay, well, if the sentence that says this sentence is false is indeed false, then what it says needs to be false. And it's telling me that the sentence is false. So that means the world must be such that the sentence is true. But then if the sentence is true, it's telling me it's false. And so the world must be such that the sentence is false. But then if the sentence is false, it's telling me that it's false, so it must be true, and so on, right? Not going to do that for an hour, but you could. And so you just have to say those things break the system. This sentence is a lie. They're paradoxes. No universal generalizations are true. This one is a little bit less obvious, but it is a sentence that is a universal generalization, and it's saying no sentences of that particular form are true. It's basically like the other two, but it's not using a demonstrative, right? So instead of saying this sentence, we can pick out the sentence in another way with a description, and it's a universal generalization. You could say something like, no sentences with 32 letters, or however many letters, the sentence, no sentences with blah, blah, blah letters. You know, you'd have to find a matching amount, but that could work too. And you could create one of these, right? So there's something to do with self-reference going on pretty clearly that causes these kinds of cases. There are also other cases where we don't have a self-contradictory sentence per se, but we have something that in the total act of saying it produces a refutation. So if someone says, I am not speaking, if that's understood as a present continuous sentence, meaning it's describing an action that's going on, that's going to be self-refuting. Because you could say, yes, you are, you just spoke, right? This is the kind of thing children really enjoy. If you whisper, I am shouting, that would be another one of these. Because something in the way that you're presenting the utterance is causing what you're saying to be its own refutation. But here, the what you're saying isn't the content of what's being said. Instead, it's something about the way that you're saying it. Something about the speech act. And so in these cases, the things you're saying are not contradictions in virtue of meaning. They're in fact false in virtue of the way they are being spoken, or the fact that they're being spoken. There's also another kind of self-refutation that I'm calling framework self-refutation. I've seen it discussed before, and I'm not sure what people call it. Sometimes it's referred to in terms of stolen concepts, but essentially what this means is that you are saying something that isn't directly self-refuting. It's not an obvious contradiction, and it isn't an obvious contradiction because there's wiggle room in terms of what the words mean. And so really the question of whether or not we actually have a self-refuting statement depends on something more than just the statement, sort of the context of the system or framework in which the statement is made. So property is theft. This is Proudhon, the French anarchist. Says property is theft. And some people will look at that and say, as Karl Marx did, that that statement is self-refuting because that statement is meant to claim that property is illegitimate because theft is understood as illegitimate. But the thing is that theft is also defined in terms of a notion of legitimate property. So what is it for someone to steal something from you? Well, it has to be your property. And not only does it have to be your property, it has to be legitimately your property, right? If you think about saying to a police officer that someone has stolen something from you, like a friend, like a baseball card, like in a sitcom, this might happen. And it turns out the police officer and the judge decide, well, this is a case where neither of you are the legitimate owner. That can happen. And in that case, you can't really say that a theft has occurred because nobody was the legitimate owner. Like it belonged to one of the brothers or something, right? So we have these cases of theft, but they rely on the idea that the person who has had their thing stolen had the property legitimately. And so to say property is theft is self-refuting, because if property is theft, then property cannot be theft. Because if property is theft, then property isn't theft. Okay? I don't know if this makes sense, but we could go on for a long time. So that is a bit different than the semantic case. It's also, though, closer to that than the so-called pragmatic cases. Because in those pragmatic cases, it's really something accidental to the content of what you're saying. There are also other cases where something about the fact that you're arguing, and this is something close to what happens with Protagoras. One of the issues that Protagoras has is this. Protagoras is arguing, and did historically argue, for a position that says essentially that everyone's position is correct. If Plato's interpretation is right of what the historical Protagoras taught, what Protagoras taught is something that has the upshot that everyone is correct, and that has the upshot, really, that we ought not to argue with people. Maybe it doesn't, because you could think that one of the things that influences what other people end up having appear to them is how you interact with them. Who knows how that could work? But in general, it's been pointed out that maybe the fact that you try to argue this position, if you're Protagoras, that is a kind of at least hypocrisy, but more like it's a refutation of your position that you care so much what other people think. Because after all, they've got the beliefs they have, and those are the things that appear to them, and you should be okay with that. You could be them. So those could also be cases. On the same lines, the earlier charge that Protagoras tried to teach people and purported to have wisdom was first given as a kind of self-refuting behavior charge. So the fact that Protagoras purports to teach people shows that he operates with some conception of wisdom, because otherwise he wouldn't have reason to be teaching. Now, in this case, of course, Protagoras could just say, I'm doing this to make money, and admit that he's a kind of false teacher, which is the charge that Plato and Socrates make against Protagoras. Protagoras is a sophist, and a sophist for Plato and Socrates and Aristotle is somebody who teaches positions that are false, but they look good. And many sophists were also relativists. And you can see how these two things would go together, because if you are a relativist and you think that anything that anybody believes is true, then understandably your motivation for action might be that you want money. Because if you believe relativism, it is common, at any rate, that you start to take a far less pure view of what beliefs are for, right? If you really don't believe that there's a truth, a moral truth, then the temptation to just kind of like be good at the game gets higher, I think. So that's what Protagoras was for Plato. And if you think about the historical Socrates, if you've ever read any of the so-called Socratic dialogues, you will know that Socrates, in a sense, gets people to refute themselves. He gets them to articulate a claim. Usually it's a definitional statement, like we have in this dialogue. And he says, I want to know some further things, and please answer me yes or no to these further things. And what he tries to do is get the individuals he's arguing with to say something that contradicts their claim. And that can be understood as a kind of self-refutation in a very wide sense. I think that I'm starting to stretch the concept a little bit, pushing it this far. But you can see that there's a kind of commonality in these cases, and that the semantic and framework are similar. They're both logical in a certain way. So, Protagorean relativism, the theory that man is the measure of all things, in the sense that anything that seems to be the case to somebody is the case for that same person, is going to be self-refuting. It's not going to be self-contradictory. And this is something that it's important to stress. So the way in which Protagorean relativism ends up being self-refuting isn't such that it produces a theory of undefined value, nor is it such that it occurs in every possible situation or every possible world. There are going to be situations in which Protagoras' theory won't be self-refuting. And to see where I'm going with this, remember that the reason that Protagoras' theory is said to be self-refuting has to do with the fact that other people don't believe it. And so I'm going to point out that if there is a situation in which everyone happens to believe Protagorean relativism, that wouldn't be a state of affairs in which Protagorean relativism was self-refuting. So it's not in every context self-refuting. It is in the context of a particular disagreement. Sometimes people refer to dialectically self-refuting claims that are self-refuting in the context of arguing. I think this is close to this. I think when dealing with these self-refutation cases, there are different categories, and sometimes it's hard to see the way particular cases fit. But in this case, we do have, at any rate, a statement that is self-refuting in a particular context where at least some people don't believe the theory. Dialectical generally, philosophers sometimes say it refers to anything involving dialogue or disagreement. To see how this is true, to see how Protagorean relativism turns out to be self-refuting in any context where there are people who do not accept the theory, it's going to make a bit of sense to first look at the theory again in greater depth and try to get a little bit more precise about what this view is. So we've looked at the typical cases of sense perception. We've looked at how the theory goes back and forth between different meanings of aesthesis. Perception, sometimes it means something more like appearance or belief even. Intuition, we might even think. There are some cases where we feel something, so to speak. We need to look now at the precise logical structure of the view so that we can get this self-refutation argument sorted out. So the first question is, what is the Protagorean theory? So at the very beginning of the dialogue, in this class, you will notice that I end up going over things a couple of times, and that's because as we learn more, we can have a deeper understanding of what's being said. It would be, I think, too much for me to try to explain everything the first time through. It's better for you to read a bit and then get more under your belt and then come back. So, man is the measure of all things, of the things which they are, that they are, and of the things which are not, that they are not. This is the way that Socrates first puts the view of Protagoras. And that is immediately followed by the second statement here. Then you know that he puts it something like this, that being Protagoras, that as each thing appears to me, so it is for me. So we have here these two claims that are connected. The second one sort of explains the first. How do we understand these precisely? What's the best way? So claim one tells us man is the measure of all things, of the things which are that they are, and of the things which are not that they are not. And as we've seen in the last few lectures, as Socrates develops it, this statement tells us that our appearances are always veridical. So anytime something appears to us to be the case or seems to us to be the case, it's always true for us. Importantly, this thesis is supposed to be necessarily true. It follows from a particular framework describing how beliefs relate to reality. It isn't just that we happen to all have true beliefs. Protagoras thinks that the nature of belief and reality determine it. Right? So the ways in which belief relates to reality is supposed to have the upshot that all beliefs are true for the person that has them. And as we saw, I think this is somewhat more plausible for certain kinds of statements than others, right? The first statement, where we were talking about the wind seeming cold to one person and seeming not cold, or rather not seeming cold to another person, that plausibly is something about which we might be relativists. Right? I think that the way that the wind feels to you is something that you really can't be mistaken about. Because that's what the word feeling means. It's picking out what's going on inside of you. You could lie about it, but be mistaken, it doesn't really make sense. So for those kinds of cases, Protagorean relativism seemed to be plausible or true. Other kinds of beliefs, though, were far more difficult to understand as extensions of this. But Protagoras wanted to understand many, many kinds of statements in this way, right? He wanted to understand statements about justice in this way. He wanted to understand statements about what is good or beneficial for a group of people, what is healthy. And we still haven't talked about those cases fully yet, but we will. Socrates also wanted to understand statements to the effect that one is a god or one can fly in this way, and so on. So we've had this idea that the way things appear to someone, that's the way they are. Now, the fact that this is necessarily true, it follows from a particular framework of how knowledge and reality relate. This fits well with the purposes for which Socrates introduced this theory. Because remember, Socrates didn't just pull this out for nothing. He brought it out when Theaetetus told him that knowledge is perception. And he did that for a reason. The reason is that Theaetetus didn't say that knowledge is true perception. He just said knowledge is perception. But of course, we can only know things that are true. And so in the absence of Theaetetus qualifying his statement by saying that knowledge is true perception, we have to make it so that perception always turns out to be true. And that's what we've done with this theory. So this guarantees that all perceptions are true, veridical. Now, claim 2 is an attempt to give a little bit more meaning to that. So claim 2, then you know that he puts it something like this, that as each thing appears to me, so it is for me. This tells us the way in which every perception is true. Every perception turns out to be true because the truth claim is relativized to an individual perceiver. Okay, now imagine for a second that Protagoras had only said the first thing, or that was the only thing we had to go on. Man is the measure of all things, of the things which are that they are, of the things which are that they are not. If someone said that, and they didn't explain to us that everyone, when they were making true statements, happened to be speaking of their own individual thought world, the contents of their consciousness, what's happened given their slow motions and the slow motions they've interacted with, because remember, we're not even allowed to speak of people on this theory. And this is something that Plato is very aware of, the fact that when we try to state this theory, we can't really find the words to do it. And this has already been thematized. Remember, there have been some parts where we've seen Socrates saying, well, people slip into these other idioms of speaking. When we're discussing this, we always end up saying things like we shouldn't. And there's going to be some further claims about language coming up and how this makes language impossible or is supposed to. But I said the idea of relativity to a person. And that's basically what we have here, or rather relativity to an individual appearance state. Because you're not said to be the same individual now as you were when you had another perception. So we have here a claim that helps us understand how every perception, how it is that man is the measure of all things, of the things which are that they are, and of the things which are not that they are not. Now imagine that we didn't put that proviso in. We didn't relativize the things about which man is the measure of all things to a certain individual. Imagine we didn't do that. That would produce a system that had obvious problems, I think, from the get-go. Because people disagree, and if one person says the sun is out and one person says the sun is not out, and they're talking about the same thing, then it looks like one of them has to be wrong and one of them has to be right. And so we would have a problem right away. Man couldn't be the measure of all things if that means everyone is right all the time and they are talking about a common world about which they disagree. If they didn't disagree, we wouldn't have the problem. But people do, and that's obvious. So this would be a non-starter. And so we need this bit that relativizes the things about which we are the measure of all things. Now, the way to understand this at first, the first thing we can say about this is that it can be expressed as a conditional claim. If something appears to me, then it is for me. As each thing appears to me, so it is for me. So if something appears to be a certain way to me, then it is that way for me. As such, we can start off by saying that this second claim, claim 2, establishes a certain sufficient condition on how things are for an individual. Now, I'm going to talk about necessary and sufficient conditions. It's very common in philosophy. I may have done this already in this class. Necessary conditions are things that need to be the case in order for something that we're talking about to be the case, that we're interested in to be the case. So a necessary condition of your passing the class is you finishing all the work. If you don't finish all the work, you can't pass. Now that is only a necessary condition. If it's not also a sufficient condition, that means that by itself, having done all the work is not good enough. A sufficient condition is something that is by itself enough to get you to some state that we're talking about or that we're interested in. So here, the state we're interested in is how things are for an individual. And here what we're saying is that if something appears to be a certain way, then that in and of itself is enough for things to be that way for that person. Okay? So claim 2 here tells us a sufficient condition that determines how things are for a person or a perceiver at a time, right? Because we don't have people. We can express it this way. If appearance, then being. Now we're going to have to give some more content to appearance and being here. But let's, for now, just treat them as black boxes. If A, then B. So we're just thinking of them as something that we're going to fill in more content in 1 second, because they have a structure. If the wind is cold for Socrates, then B is cold for Socrates, or something like that. The wind is cold for Socrates. So we have here this statement. If appearance, then being. Now, we're going to talk in the next couple of slides of what this word appearance has to mean. Okay, what can it mean, and what does it mean given what the dialogue has said so far? On this slide, I want to mention something that is very important for understanding how the self-refutation argument works. Okay, this is something that Bernier observes, and it's a really important observation in understanding this argument. And that's that however we're going to understand this claim, if things appear to someone in a certain way, then as a sufficient condition they are that way for that same person. We have this if-then statement. We need to understand if appearance, then being. It has to be the case if this is a real statement that has a meaning, that isn't just vacuous, that isn't just what we call a tautology, which means something that's true in virtue of meaning. For example, if I say, my dad is my dad, just in virtue of what those words mean, the sentence has to be true. At the same time, it's not saying anything. That's why we say it's a tautology. Tautos means the same in Greek. So you're saying the same thing. So here we have if appearance, then being. So what Bernier points out is that if we understand what it means for someone to appear to someone in the exact same way as we understand what it is for something to be for someone, this claim is not going to be interesting. And the theory that Protagoras articulates is going to have to be a tautology. It's just true in virtue of repeating the same thing twice. And it's an if-then statement. And so you're basically saying if A, then A. That's what I have below it. So if A, then A. We don't know whether it's true that A, so we don't know whether it's true that A. But saying if A, then A, if you wrote that in a proof, you would be saying something that was obvious and something that should be completely not controversial, but also something that doesn't really add anything in most cases. So A equals A, any statement of this form, right, is a tautology. What this means, though, is that a condition on our understanding the theory has to be that what it is for something to appear for someone and what it is for something to be for that person has to be two different things. Okay? So we have to understand what it is for something to appear to me differently then we understand what it is for a thing to be true for me. If I understand what it means for something to appear to me in terms of I perceive it, I cannot then understand what it is for something to be for me as I have a perception of it. There needs to be a difference between these two things. Likewise, if I understand it appears to me as I believe it, I can't have it is for me be equivalent to I believe it. Okay? Now, this might seem like it's unnecessary to say, but I think if you think about that section that we've just gotten through, especially when we're talking about the hallucinations and the dreams cases, in those cases, it's hard for me at least to hold apart the idea that we have to have two things. The thing that we believe and then some truth condition. Because when we have these perceptual appearances, it's kind of like the wind feels cold to me, and it's true in virtue of the fact that it feels that way. And so it's hard to hold the appearance apart from the thing that makes the appearance true. Okay? So that's why I go through all of this discussion. And that's also why Bernier does it, I think, because he doesn't quite say this, but I'm sure this must be why, because this is a case where we're liable to have our, minds conflate the two, and it's actually hard to keep them apart. And one of the bigger problems with this theory that I see too is that it's harder to know how we have a belief and then something that the belief is about, or an appearance and then something that the appearance is about. And I've been stressing this as we've gone through the earlier stuff, because I've been talking about the idea that in some arguments, it looks like the content of the belief drops out. The fact that it's supposed to refer to the world kind of disappears. So this is a condition on our interpretation of what Protagoras must mean. Whatever it means for something to appear to someone, it has to be different than what it means for something to be a certain way for someone. So what does appearance mean in this claim B? We have if appearance then being, if A then B. So if we look at the dialogue so far, it's obvious that in the course so far, appearance has come to mean two different things. These two things are related to the two meanings of the word aesthesis that I have been highlighting. The narrower meaning where it means sense perception, and this is the more common one, but also a meaning that's still in Plato's mind, where it means something more like appearance or seeming, even. Awareness, I think is what I said. So we have here this idea that the word that we mean when we say aesthesis, the act through which things appear to us, it can mean two things. It can mean that I'm perceiving it in a certain way. Something appears to someone if they perceive it to be that way. I perceive that the wind is cold is another way to say the wind appears cold to me. There's also cases where something appears to someone if they believe it to be that way. The madman was said to perceive, to have aesthesis of the fact that he is God. Or the madman has aesthesis of the fact that he can fly. And it seems he can fly. So you can say, I perceive that I'm God. It's more natural to say, I believe that I'm God, right? But even in our word perceive, you can see this play, right? I mentioned it before, it's no accident that so many words that have to do with cognitive awareness are modeled on vision in particular. So we have what it means for something to appear. And I also stressed, and this is true of both of these cases, that these appearances have an internal structure. They predicate a quality of a subject. So in our first example that we had, it appears to one person that the wind is cold. It appears to another person that the wind is not cold. Or to another person, it does not appear that the wind is cold. And there's going to be a difference between those two things that I just said. It's going to be important to understand. But that's the structure here. The wind is cold. Appearance claims have the form X is F for a person. The wind is cold for me. I am a madman. X is F. So that's the first part. What it means for something to appear to someone is for X to be F for them. Our claim B, though, says if appearance, then being. If something appears to someone a certain way, then it is for that person in that way. So what does the being part mean? Well, we saw already that, as Bernier points out, what it is for something to be for someone can't be the same thing as we've already said is going on when something appears for someone to be a certain way. So it can't be that things being a certain way for someone just means that they perceive or believe that they're that way. So what does it mean? Well, recall that here we are trying to provide a theory of knowledge, what it is for someone to know something, and that we accepted the measure doctrine as a way to make all appearances true. So we're interested somehow or other in truth here. And so what does it mean then to say that something is a certain way, that reality is a certain way for someone in the way relevant to truth? Well, here we get the idea of correspondence. Most philosophers, and this is certainly a widespread view, think that truth is a matter of correspondence. And usually if there's a difference over whether truth is a matter of correspondence, it's a question of whether beliefs can apply individually to a world or whether a whole framework of beliefs can apply to a world. But it's pretty intuitive to think that something is true if and only if it corresponds to the external world, right? If I say the cat is on the mat, that sentence is true if and only if the cat is on the mat. Now, this sounds terribly uninformative, but you have to remember one of these is a sentence, and one of these is a condition in the world that makes that sentence true, or under which that sentence is true. So that's correspondence. And the basic idea of correspondence is that if a sentence is true, that must be because something in the external world that is different from the appearance itself, the appearance that things are true, I call it an appearance external, some appearance external world corresponds to whatever is expressed in the sentence. Now, I put world in scare quotes because normally when we talk about an appearance external world, we mean the common world that we all live in. But of course, in Protagonist, we're not going to have that, right? We've already seen this. It's relativism. So, world. There's some idea of a world external to the belief itself that this belief corresponds to. Whatever this belief or appearance expresses, that's the way the world is. Okay? So that's what it's going to mean for something to be a certain way for somebody. Now, appearances for Plato, we already saw, have a certain form. We just saw that. Appearances are of the form X is F. They're predicative. They predicate a quality of something. Those are the ones we're focused on. The wind is cold. So correspondence theories of truth are going to tell us that the appearance X is F will be veridical, will be true, if an appearance external world contains the fact that X is F. Right? So X is F is true if in the external world it is the case that X is F. The cat is on the mat is true if in the world that's external to the belief that the cat is on the mat, if the cat in that world is on the mat. The thing picked out by the cat is on the thing picked out by the word mat. So we have if appearance, then reality, being. As a first step, we can say that a way to understand that is if it appears that X is F, then X is F in some world. Right? We haven't put the relativism in yet. Right? We've talked about it, but the formulation, I'm trying to do it one step at a time. So now we've just got, in general, if it's true to say that a person is the measure, and that means if something appears, then that thing is, the first thing that we might want to say is, well, then that it's saying that everybody who has a belief, those beliefs are always right. And so anytime someone has a belief, the world corresponds to it. And So there's some world that's going to make the statement, the wind is cold, true. That's going to correspond to that statement. Now, of course, we are talking about a relativistic theory. And so we need to introduce the relativism back in, because that was how this theory was guaranteeing that the claim that man is the measure of all things is not just contingently something that happens to be true. It's true in virtue of some bigger framework. So if we had a non-relativistic theory of truth, a theory of objective truth, then correspondence between true statements and reality would take the form of correspondence between somebody's statements and some common external world. And we already saw, if that was how we were to understand the statement, man is the measure of all things, and we didn't add this idea that all the statements we make are about relativistic worlds, then we would have a theory that wouldn't really attract much attention. Because it's not possible if I say the sun is shining and you say the sun is not shining and we're talking about the same thing, it's impossible for both of us to be right. So the cat on the mat is true if the cat is on the mat, right? That would be the way we'd understand this if we were talking about objective truth and we meant the cat on the mat in the common world that we all have access to. As we've seen, though, Protagorean relativism makes every appearance true for a particular individual, the one who has the appearance. And what this means is that when we talk about correspondence, we need to talk about correspondence relative to a particular world. So there's a correspondence between the way things appear to somebody and the way things are for that person. And the second claim is relative to the world that they happen to inhabit at the time when the appearance occurs. So we need some external reality, external to the appearance itself, to make it so that the appearance is veridical. It's describing or representing things accurately. If it's a belief that it's true. And that external thing is going to be provided by the world of a particular individual. So we have now this idea of something being true in somebody's world. Okay, so in Protagoras' world, certain things are true. In Protagoras' world, the things that appear to Protagoras are the things that are for Protagoras. In my world, the things that appear to me are for me. And we're all describing our own worlds. And that's what it means to talk about what it means to say that things are for an individual in terms of a world. So we can represent this by adding subscripts to the sufficient condition linking appearance and reality. Now, I'm trying not to make this too technical, but at a certain point, it does simplify. So I wrote here, if A and then Socrates, that just means if something appears to Socrates, then B, Socrates, means then it has being of that kind for Socrates, or that it is that way for Socrates. So if A Socrates, then B Socrates, and we could say if A S, then B S. It's too small to see, but if A theaetetus, then B theaetetus. If there's an appearance of A to theaetetus, then B exists to theaetetus. But remember, we also had some idea of what A and B look like. We can take an X-ray of them and look at what the structure, what's going on inside A and B, and that's going to say X is F in both cases. Because remember, the appearances, when we asked what are they like, they're appearances that such and such is the case, that the wind is cold. So we can rewrite this to say if X is F, Socrates, then X is F, Socrates. So what this says is that if X is F is the appearance that Socrates has, then in the Socrates world, it is the case that X is F. This is just a way to rewrite. If X appears F to Socrates, then X is F for Socrates. Okay? So if X is F appears to Socrates, then in the Socrates world, X is F. So this statement tells us about a sufficient condition that enables us to infer what is true in a world. If X is F appears to a particular individual, then X is F in that individual's world, and the statement is true. So if it appears to me the wind is cold, then for me, in my mental space, or whatever you want to call it, the wind is cold. You're saying the wind is not cold. We're not disagreeing because you're describing your world. And your statement is true because your statement is about something different. So we have here these two claims. Man is the measure of all things, of the things which are that they are, and of the things which are not that they are not. And as a thing, each thing appears to me, so it is for me. And the second one of these we had to unpack a little bit more. But statement 2 was supposed to give us the theory of truth that makes the measure doctrine in statement 1 correct. Because remember, if we don't have it, this is important. If we don't have this theory, then the measure doctrine is going to be a non-starter, because it can't be, if we're all thinking about the same world, that this measure doctrine is true given the fact that we all disagree about many things. So statement 2 was supposed to help us understand how 1 can be right. And all of this were supposed to help us understand how knowledge is perception can be a reasonable thing to say. So if X is F for Socrates, if X is F appears to Socrates, I should say, then X is F in the Socrates world. Okay, we have a sufficient condition on something being the case in the Socrates world, namely that it appears that way to somebody. Now, there's a problem when we try to look at statement 1 and statement 2. Even though statement 2 is supposed to go with statement 1, there's a little issue, because in statement 1, we get a reference to people being a measure of the things which are that they are, and of the things which are not that they are not. So if you look at statement 2, all it talks about is how things are, right? As each thing appears to me, so it is for me. That's how things are. Statement 1 talks about how things are and how things are not. So what we have an issue with doesn't need to be a problem, but it's something that we need to think about, is how we figure out, if we are the measure, how do we determine which things are not? Because we're the measure of those things too, and so the theory in statement 2 has to find some way to apply to the claim made in statement 1 that we're the measure of things that are not. So this statement that we're the measure of things that are not, it contains the word not, which is a negation. And in order to combine 1 and 2 and get a single framework that makes sense, we need to find some way of understanding how it is that statements about what is not relate to reality, so that we are the measure of what is not. How do our appearances of what is not relate to reality? So we measure what is in terms of the appearances that we have. Question then, how do we measure what is not? This statement contains a negation, it has the word not. Negations are difficult in philosophy because they often introduce ambiguities when applied to statements of the form X is F. Now, I give an example. I said that he is not coming is not the same as I did not say that he is coming. All right? The first one is me saying he is not coming. The second one is me perhaps not saying anything at all. Right? I might have said that he is not coming, but in the second one, it leaves it open. I can have the second one be true if I simply say nothing. I didn't say he's coming. Right? I didn't tell you he wasn't, but I didn't say he was. Right? Those are different. And so when we have a not in these X is F, here we have he is coming. When we're throwing a not in there, there's a question about which of these two locations we put it in. And this happens a lot in philosophy when we're talking about negation. And a lot of big questions end up turning on this point about where we put the not. So we have two options for where to put the not. We might think that we measure what is not by having a belief that something is not. So we have a positive belief that we've expressed or have about the issue. We don't even need to express it. We have an appearance about the issue that determinately says X is not F. So we have an appearance that's of a negative sort of form. If it appears that X is not F, then X is not F. So here, if it appears to Socrates that the wind is not cold, then the wind is not cold, right? So if Socrates has the determinate belief to the effect that the wind is not cold, then the wind is not cold. Now, notice that this is just a special case of saying X is F, where X happens to be not F. So we can say X is not F. So if X is F, then X is F, but we're substituting for our F not F. If you don't understand what I'm saying, don't worry about it. We might think that that's the way we're to understand how we get to be the measure of what is not. Namely, that if we have a belief in our minds that something is not the case, then the world is the way that corresponds to our belief. So the world is not the way that we think it is not. Alternatively, though, we could have a wider reading of what it means to be the measure of things that are not. We might also think we can measure what is not simply by not having the opposed belief. So here, if it does not appear that X is F, then X is not F. Now this leaves it open that we might also satisfy it by having the determinate positive belief that X is not F. But here, even if we've never thought about the matter, it's never appeared to us at all that X is F, that would be enough to say that for us, X is not F. So what I'm saying here is, imagine that I've never thought about Protagoras' theory. Is it true to say that Protagoras' theory is not true in my world? On statement 1, no. On the first interpretation, no. Because I don't have a belief that it's not true. I don't deny it. I don't have an appearance that it's not true. On statement 2, the fact that I don't have an appearance of it is sufficient to say that it is not for me. And these are our two options. Now, following Bernier again, option 2 is the right one. It makes the most sense of what is said in the dialogue. So in the wind example, look at it carefully. This is meant to show us what it means for us to be the measure of what is and what is not. Now, doesn't it sometimes happen that when the same wind is blowing, one of us feels cold and the other not? Or that one of us feels rather cold and the other very cold? That certainly does happen. Well then, in that case, are we going to say that the wind itself, by itself, is cold or not cold? Or shall we listen to Protagoras and say that it is cold for the one who feels cold and for the other not cold? Now, first thing to notice here, just in passing, we're explicitly denying that we're talking, in either case, of the way the wind is itself by itself. Now, we're not supposed to say the way it is. But what we can say is that it is cold for the one who feels cold, and for the other it's not cold. We're focused here on the other. As Bernier notes, Socrates doesn't say that the other here has the belief or the appearance that the wind is not cold but warm, for example. It simply says that the other feels not cold. Sorry, the other does not feel cold. It's very tricky here. So it says one of us feels cold and the other not. Now, we could interpret that to mean the other determinately denies in their mind that it's not cold, or it could just be that the other person doesn't have the appearance of cold. Okay? So this is less meaningful when we're talking about these perceptual appearances. When it comes to beliefs, it's important, and it's going to be important for the way we understand the self-refutation argument to some extent. So, second piece of evidence for option 2, this is one that Bernier doesn't have, but I think it's slightly stronger. In the section that we're going to be looking at, and what of Protagoras himself? Must he not say that supposing he himself did not believe that man is a measure, any more than that the majority of people who indeed do not believe it, then this truth which he wrote is true for no one. So here we have a claim about the majority of people who are said not to believe that man is the measure, And this makes it the case that it's not true for them that man is the measure. It's not true in their worlds that man is the measure. Now, it doesn't seem plausible to say that the majority of people have all thought about this and have all come to a determinate answer. The answer is no. Most of them haven't had any appearance about this theory because they don't know the theory. Also, the words here say that the majority, they're said not to believe that Protagoras' measure doctrine is true. It's said not to be true for them. It's more plausible to think that what's going on here is most people either have the determinate view that it's not true, but that's going to be a minority of people. The majority is going to be constituted not only by those people, but also by people who simply haven't thought about it. So people on the street, so to speak, who've never heard or thought about this theory, it's not true for them either because it doesn't appear to them. They don't have to have the opposite appearance, or they don't have to explicitly deny the appearance. So to recap, what I've just done, and this is following Bernier's argument, so if this is unclear, you can read the Bernier too, is indicate that this idea that we're the measure of what is and what is not, I said earlier that we're to understand part of it, or one thing that's definitely true given this statement, is in terms of a sufficient condition for something's being the case in a particular world, in somebody's private world. So something is the case in somebody's private world if it appears to that person that it is that way. So if it appears in Socrates' world that X is F, then X is F Socrates. That's a sufficient condition. So this tells us that a sufficient condition on being F for the Socrates world, or in the Socrates world, is X appearing F to Socrates. What we've learned now by this choice of which of the two interpretations of how things get to be not in our realities is that if someone has no belief that X of F is F, then X is not F for that person. And here, this can be they don't have the appearance or belief that the wind is cold. It could be that they don't have the appearance or belief that the measure doctrine is true. This can be expressed then as a necessary condition on something's being the case for a person. This is the upshot of the work I just did in terms of understanding how we get the negation to come out to be true in our worlds. So what does it mean for things to be not in our worlds? So if X is F for Socrates in the Socrates world, then it appears to Socrates that X is F. Now, if you look, this is a flip of the first one. So if it appears to Socrates that X is F, then in the Socrates world, X is F. Now we have if X is F in the Socrates world, then it appears to Socrates that X is F. So this is going the other way. So the first one's telling us what has to be the case if something appears to Socrates. If it appears to Socrates, then it has to be the case that that's the way it is for Socrates. The second one is telling us what has to be the case if something is a certain way in the world of an individual. If something is a certain way in that individual's world, then it appears to that individual that things are that way. This is another way to express the idea that if someone doesn't have an appearance, then things are not that way for them. So if things are for a certain way for a person, it can't be either that they're not that way for the person, that they have a determinate belief to the effect that that's not how things are, nor can it be that they simply have no belief. Okay? So we have here a necessary and sufficient condition set. So we can express this in this way. The Protagorean theory is this. Protagoras believes that X is F for someone if and only if it appears to that person that X is F. So we have two statements. If it appears to someone that X is F in that person's private world. If it does not appear to someone that X is not F in that person's private world. We can take that second statement and flip it around and say that if X is F in someone's private world, it appears to that person that X is F. Okay? We get a necessary and sufficient condition. So if something is a certain way in someone's world, a necessary condition for that being the case is it appearing that way. If something appears a certain way, a sufficient condition for it being a certain way has been realized. Now, hopefully what I've said isn't way too difficult and abstract. I can't tell because I'm not in a room with you, and so I can't see people's faces. And that's one of the hard things about teaching this way is like, I rely on what people are looking like to see whether or not I'm making sense, especially when we get to this level of abstraction. One way to help understand what's being claimed here by these necessary and sufficient conditions is to think about the example that Plato already brought in of how this theory works, which had to do with dreams and hallucinations. So one way to understand this relativism that Plato already brought our attention to involves these dreams and hallucinations. This example can help us better understand what's expressed by this idea of necessary and sufficient conditions that we just gave. It also, to make matters even better, helps us understand what I was saying about the claims about how things are being relative to a particular world. Okay? So here's the thing. Imagine you have a dream, and in your dream, you perceive a red dog. Okay, so you have a dream. In that dream, you perceive a red dog. If I ask the question about your dream world, and this is a world that's relative to you, the dreamer, nobody else has your dream world. If I ask about your dream world, is there a red dog in the world of your dream? The answer is going to be yes, right? And this isn't just going to be necessarily one dream world of yours. It might be relativized to a time, like in your dream world last night. Now, of course, we don't remember everything that happens in our dreams, and so this example isn't perfect, but imagine you're having like a lucid dream where you're aware that you're dreaming, and someone asks you in your dream, is there a red dog in your dream? Well, if you've had a red dog appear to you in your dream, then the answer to that question is yes, right? Is there a red dog in the world of your dream? Yeah. So that's a way to express the sufficient condition. If it appears to you in your dream that there's a red dog, then in the world of your dream, there is a red dog. There's no difference between, or there's no disagreement possible between appearance and reality in dreams. In a dream, if you don't perceive a red dog, then it's also true to say that there is not a red dog in the world of your dream, right? So you have a dream, you don't perceive a red dog, you wake up with total recall of your dream, or maybe I find some way to talk to you while you're dreaming and I ask you, is there a red dog in the world of your dream? If you haven't seen one, the answer is going to be no, because your dream is constituted by whatever you've dreamt so far. And the answer that you might want to give, like, well, let me look around, when we're talking about dreams, it doesn't quite work, right? So this is a way that I find helpful to think about this. So we have in the second case a necessary condition of there being a red dog in your dream. Namely, if there is a red dog in the world of your dream, it has to have appeared to you. Okay? Both of these give us the necessary sufficient conditions, and we get this idea that the claim about being, the way things are in your world, is relative to your dream world. My dream world is going to have a different set of appearances and a different reality. So this is what the fullest, elucidation of this theory looks like. If it appears to someone that things are the case, then it is for them that things are that way. And if it is for them that things are a certain way, then it has to have appeared to them that things are that way. That's what we're saying here. Now, at this point, we can move on to the self-refutation argument. I am going, however, to take a break and continue this in class on Tuesday because I want to make sure that you have time to process what was said in the last bit. Okay, so this is only an hour and change. If you don't understand it, listen to it again. Have a great weekend.